Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Des Moines, Iowa, to be exact. Iowa Catholic Radio. I'm Bo Bonner. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing down at Mercy College. Bud, what do you do kicking about the old town?
So I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college, and I wanted to give you another word of gratitude, Bo. I know in a recent episode, we did a sneak preview of my parish mission at St. Anthony's Catholic Church.
All right, how'd that go?
I thought it went okay. I'll give myself a solid B+.
You almost said C. You're so mean to yourself.
I was going to say A-, but I thought, the true judges are those who are in attendance, so I don't want to jump the shark.
We were saying that the show last week was an appetizer, and yours was the meal. So B+, what you're going to say is it tasted good, and it was filling.
Well, and if I sort of leave behind the self-deprecating approach to it all, it was fun for me. My son Dominic was baptized at St. Anthony's, so it was nice to be back there. And I'm always encouraged when I see like the way that God's working in different parishes here in Des Moines. Some really good things going on at St. Anthony's.
That is fantastic. What else is fantastic, of course, is that we are underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Thank you for underwriting the show. mchs.edu. But I know the weather has not made up its mind about what it wants to do. It's in that interesting phase, February through March, where there could be a tornado and it snow on the same day. I mean, that's pretty regular talk. We're not breaking any sort of barriers here pointing this out. I do think our students, however, they're getting in that time right before midterms are coming up. They're going to be on spring break. So if the weather hasn't made up its mind, certainly the semester is making up its mind that pretty soon we'll be on the other side of the hill. It's nice to be around people who are have their hands dirty in the garden of learning, and it's wonderful to be a part of Mercy College, who underwrites our show.
Yeah, I'm funny. I'm not a big weather guy in the sense that I don't pay close attention to what's coming down the pike, but I do have to say I was a little disappointed with February. I know we say like this is the day that the Lord has made, but I'm kind of a winter guy. February was not very winterish, but then again, we'd probably get hit with like weather that we were getting during like MLK period, and I'd be complaining the other direction. So
it's true. It's interesting that I think what you'll see happen with some years is when you have a January that was absolutely as severe as ours, like some of it at least, and then February backs off. I think we got a sucker punch coming back. I don't want to predict because people think I brought it on us, but I can see March having a few trick up its sleeve still.
Well, I got a real sense of the different characters to winter around the country because during one of the really unseasonably warm weeks here in Des Moines, some of my friends in Pittsburgh were like, oh, that groundhog, he was really like leading us astray. So Pittsburgh must have been a little colder in February.
Oh, interesting. Did it snow a lot in Pittsburgh, or did it mostly just rain the whole time?
When I lived there?
Yeah.
We didn't get that much snow, but I think Jensers who had grown up there, they said that was kind of unusual, that this time frame is very different than their childhood. I couldn't tell if it was one of those like walking both ways uphill when we were kids, but it sounded like more snow in the 80s. Rachel and I were recently down south, and I think it was warmer here than it was when we were in Florida.
Well, that's it's good to know that you're not having too good of a time.
Yeah.
Speaking of having a good time, though, we're going to talk about truth today. I know we bring that up a bit, but we're going to talk about the truth on truth. You'll see what we're talking about. Stick around. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, I said we were going to talk about the truth about truth. That, of course, is a massive subject. I'm not so silly as to act like we're going to talk about the entirety of truth itself. But I do think, how's a nice way of putting this? There are narratives afoot in the world. There are things coming to bear on everybody's daily life that, of course, make the world seem, I don't know, hyper-pitched, comparatively, maybe all times seem like they're electric with possibility and worry and doom. But certainly it's the case that we have people across the spectrum in Catholicism, in the popular culture, who really think they have a bead on what's going to happen in the future. And one of the things that people constantly throw out is they talk about us being a post-truth society. Yeah. One of the things that I worry about that is that seems to act like at some point, like in 1985, before that, everything was always true. It's an interesting idea about what we're getting at here. But I do think it's important to start talking about what people confuse for the truth and why they confuse those things and why that might have a lot to do with media environments that we live in, the way that we process stories. And one of the ones that I want to get at is one that we harp on all the time, but I think we'll branch off in a different way. I'm sure people have heard me talk about the difference between truth and certainty, and that we often confuse the search for truth for certainty itself. But before we get there, I'm gonna lob a softball up there for you. But I know you've talked about this quite a bit. How many times when you have told someone that you've converted to Catholicism that knew you before being Catholic, did you get some version of you just did it for the comfort of certainty? Oh, yeah. Maybe talking about that might begin to suss out what I think people are dealing with now, even when it comes just to everything from what news reports should I believe to what does it mean to hold firmly to Catholic teaching?
I've definitely heard that sort of thing. You know, I grew up in a evangelical context, and so their church polity or church form of governance is real congregational. There are not bishops who oversee things on a regional level, but it's really sort of church by church basis. And within that context, there was a really strong sense of each person having to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. Well, Catholics can imagine, those who are listening, how chaotic that would sometimes get. It's funny because on the flip side, Protestants in their mind often assume that the Catholic Church is very monolithic, like everybody just gets in the building and believes and says all the same things. We had a professor in graduate school who joked that if you think that way, get a Benedictine, a Jesuit, and a Franciscan in the room. Mm-hmm. We all know, it can be a raucous scene, like in the Catholic Church as well. And then, so that was my childhood. You and I, we've mentioned on the show before, we attended Duke Divinity School. That's United Methodist, so that's more what's called like mainline Protestantism. It's a little older reaching, and today, mainline Protestantism is kind of characterized by, for lack of a better term, like a more progressive viewpoint. They sort of, there's a real like creative engagement. I'm being charitable here too with what's going on in the world. So on social issues and things, they may track more what we would call liberal in our context. All that to say, when we had conversations with Methodist friends, they sometimes felt like, well, you're exchanging the messiness or sort of the chaos of Methodism, mainline Protestantism, for a community that's characterized by certainty, where once you become Catholic, you can, so to speak, flip the brain switch off, like check your brain at the door, and the church will have all of the answers for you. You can just open up your catechism, look up topic H and find what the answer is for that question.
See, what I find interesting, thank you, that is a wonderful way to branch off into what I hope we're getting at today. One of the things that has become apparent to me is when I became convinced of the truth of the Catholic faith, which is, I'll shorthand that for saying conversion, when I turned to the truths of the faith and affirmed them and said that I would follow them, my life has never been certain since that moment. Like, there's been a lot of twists and turns, and things that I would have never predicted, those nearly 2 decades ago at this point. It's getting close there. For instance, Bud, we've now worked together at Mercy College twice. That involved you going to Pittsburgh. That did not involve like some game plan of ours. We kind of converted around the same time. I don't think either of us were talking about our long-term plans. I don't know if any of us had ever mentioned the state of Iowa to each other at that time. So I guess one thing that's important before we keep going here is to do something that the logicians call coming to terms. I've been on a streak on this with any time I've had a chance to either teach a class or make a reflection, so it's sort of on my mind. words and their meanings change quite often, which, for instance, is why in the past the legal systems of Europe would be in Latin and not in the vernacular. It could be because of gatekeeping. I'm not acting like humans weren't involved. But the sort of impetus behind it was you needed a legal language that rarely changed so that the words matched the terms they were getting at as possible. Whereas if you have a living talking language that starts to be, slangified because it's just used, words change all the time. We, of course, deal with this now because our legal codes are in vernacular. So let alone, like, if you think about the founding fathers' documents that are, centuries old, and us trying to decide whether, think about, this is in the Supreme Court, for instance, what does a firearm mean in 1776 compared to 2024, right? So already we have to sort of translate because we don't live in that world anymore. But what I'm getting at is what you have to do as a logician is come to terms, which means words can change, and we can even use them in nearly opposite ways. So whenever we're going to talk, whoever we're talking to, we have to come to terms saying, we mean by this word to point to this reality. So when it comes to something like truth and certainty, I would say a lot of people go, isn't that the same thing? I'm going to, again, throw you a softball to just dwell on real quick. Initially, Bud, when I say I am on team certainty and truth aren't the same, do you agree or disagree, and why? Just like a first initial thoughts.
Okay, I'll make this brief, I think, because it sounds like you're going in a specific direction, and I don't want to. I've got another idea that I'll come back to. But with your specific question, I think there is a distinction there. And what I have in mind, actually, is there are things that we can be certain about, but to be on team truth, you have to have a good sense of what that entails. And what I mean by that is, say the creed that we confess each Sunday, those are revealed truths from God. And so St. Thomas Aquinas says, God cannot lie. If we know something has been revealed by God, then we know it to be true with certitude. Even when we talk about the Catholic faith, so you might disagree on this point, I'm not sure, but there are things that the church teaches, and if you read the document, it would sound very, very definitive, but I think it's of a different order than creedal statements. So what I have in mind is the church has a whole tradition of Catholic social teaching, one of the themes of the show, and especially in relation to Christians' situatedness within different political orders. And it's not that those things are not true, but some of them are sort of time dependent, such that if you just lifted a sentence from, say, what Leo the 13th said about governments and tried to strictly apply it in our own day and age, you could run into some problematic interpretations. But even beyond that, so this is maybe I'm bound to step on some toes here. In the Catholic Church, you have a whole small t tradition of private revelation. And some of those private revelations are very compelling. I've meditated on them myself. But there's a way in which I've heard Catholics, individual Catholics, use private revelation where if you disagree with their interpretation of private revelation, it's like you're disagreeing with the church.
Yep.
And I think with receiving those revelations and then especially with applying them, we don't have the certitude that's given to us with the trust that we put like in creedal statements.
Yeah, so I am tracking with what you're saying. So I think, of course, when we use the English words truth and certainty and certitude, there's a lot of latitude and multiple definitions. I want to pare it down, and for today, just talk about a certain pair of distinctions. One I'm going to call certitude, one I'm going to call truth. And what I'm going to say is the truth has to deal with objective reality. So we can say there's the truth, and truth is something to the effect of, if you have it, that's the mind's adequation to reality, like the world and your mind are adequately related. We can also talk about truth as sort of the noun truth, like truth is the thing out there that is the case, whatever that means. Certainty, it seems to me, has to do with a subjective reality, like I can be certain or not. And so this is where the church comes in about certitude. The church as a person, right? It is a body. It's not like you or me, but it's the body of Christ. It can say with certainty things are true, which means that the church itself subjectively claims through its authority of certitude of a truth. And so what I'm getting at, Bud, why I think there's a distinction is I can assent to truths of which I am not certain, right? Do you think that's possible?
You sound very Newmanian, actually.
Correct. But like, is that possible?
Yes.
And so what would be an example? Do you have one in mind? Like, what would be a way that you say, I assent to a truth that I'm not certain about? What I would get at is literally anything scientific that's beyond my sort of
scope of knowledge,
right.
Or expertise.
Right. So like I assent to the truth that satellites orbit, and that my phone uses satellites to do GPS. I am not certain in any way how that works. And if in a very weird way, someone goes like, okay, actually we were all pulling a trick on you, that was never the case, I would be like, okay, I have serious trust issues now. But like, I'm like, oh, I guess, right? Like I don't have the sort of certainty of how orbital calculus works.
Does this help or muddy the waters? So Newman, during his time when he's talking about these kinds of ideas, he says that Englishmen naturally possess certainty about the fact that England is an island. He says, although very few of them have ever circumvented the island of England.
Correct. Yeah, I think that it's something to that effect. Now, I will also say, of course, to point that is like, I think a lot of people would assent to that truth and be certain about it, but I also think you can assent to it without being certain about it, right? And I don't think it necessarily has to do only with things you've personally observed. Like, I don't want to make it too empirical, of course. But the point that I get at is that biographical one that I started out with. I assented to the truths of the Catholic faith, and what people throw out is like, well, you just wanted the certainty that someone else's truth made you feel. And I go, well, often I've not always been certain about all of those things. To use Newman's phrase, I'm not saying that I doubted a lot what the church said.
Yeah.
I don't even, by the time I became Catholic, I didn't really have that many difficulties. Yet again, Newman making the difference between doubt being something that sort of fundamentally overrides or like knocks out a pillar necessary to believe a truth, and difficulties just like, I can't work it out in my head. That's painting with a large brush there. I didn't really even have difficulties. What I had no certitude about was what that would mean for my life.
Yeah.
And what I think people are saying is, well, Bud, when you guys converted, what you wanted was the feeling of certitude about your life, because living in the, as you said, quote, messiness that they saw the non-Catholic world living in was somehow psychologically arduous for us. And honestly, I have to say my life has gotten more complicated just in the sort of living of it by assenting to truths that personally I was certain of as far as like their truth, but very much not certain, and I can tell you, in error, in fact, about what it would mean for my life, what it would look like, Bud, once I became Catholic, to live that sort of life out. And well, before I get to the next thing, do you think that that's a profitable way to make that distinction, to talk about the difference between truth and certainty?
Well, it is. And I was going to share a quote from Newman. Again, it's difficult to pull a piece of a work out of context and just share it, but is this getting at something that you're saying? So he's actually in this is before he's Catholic, and he's in conversation with skeptics who are critical of Christianity. And Newman at some point says, life is for action. If we insist on proofs for everything, we shall never come to action. To act, you must assume, and that assumption is faith. And I guess when he wrote that, he felt like skeptics, critics of Christianity, were placing a higher bar for persons of faith than they themselves were willing to adhere to. And I guess where it maps onto the kind of conversation that we're having is that sometimes members of other even like Christian denominations will sort of act like, well, for you guys, like epistemology and how you know what you know and believe what you know is different than what we're doing.
Right.
And I don't know. I don't know if it's radically different. I would say the authority of the church operates in a different manner, but it's certainly not this question of like, well, one party is characterized by certitude and the other is just, living amidst the messiness of life.
Right. and that's it, is I would say your certitude about anything is not necessary or sufficient to adherence to the truth.
Okay.
So I go to like Socrates, who absolutely believed in the truth, but was uncertain about nearly anything after that. And so his sort of take on everything, right, is people would act like they're very certain about what they were and what they believed and how their life was, and then they would be skeptical about the truth itself. And he argued it's exactly the opposite. We can be certain that there's truth, in that we can follow the truth and be very uncertain about ourselves, what that looks like.
Yeah.
And that's not skepticism like you're pointing at, right? Like the skeptic sets above it all and seems to think what's close and near is somehow akin to sight. Like, well, I can see it really easy, but the truth is far off, so I don't really see it at all. The point I'm making is the truth might be far off, but actually because it's simple, can be adhered to and assented to, whereas the things that we seem like we should be most certain about, ourselves, where the world is right now, oftentimes we have an undue certainty attached to it. And I think that relates exactly to people when they, I don't want to act like we're great or perfect. I'm trying to say a psychological thing that happens all the time. I think when people go, oh, well, you became whatever, in our case, Catholics, you just wanted certainty. I've learned to start to ask, well, do you want certainty? And that's why you can only imagine that other people want that. So that's the only reason they'd make a radical change. Because I think that makes more sense than saying, I became Catholic to make things certain, because, again, the life I had planned out for myself diverged radically after I said, I'm going to follow this truth come what may.
Well, to make it very personal, and this goes back to Newman's statement that life is for action. When I came into the Catholic Church, I wouldn't say that all of my difficulties had been resolved. And so I was still wrestling with certain things. And my actual assent to what the church teaches was progressive. Now, on Easter Vigil, well, I wasn't received at Easter Vigil. On the Feast of the Holy Name of Mary, when I came into the church, I did say that I trusted all that the church teaches to be true. But I guess what I'm saying is, even before that moment where life is for action, I was continuing to wrestle with things, and I felt like if I was going to wait until I had the kind of certitude that other folks sometimes talk about, it wasn't going to happen. Like, I could defer perpetually, but I knew that to achieve anything in life, or to not just be frozen by paralysis, requires a certain level of trust. I may have mentioned this on the show recently, but I've been thinking a lot about God's calling different persons in the Bible. And so, like with Abraham, he says to Abraham, go to the land I will show you.
Right.
And so Abraham has a certitude, so to speak, when it comes to, I will follow God wherever he leads me. I almost hit the soundboard. I don't know.
I doubt that's how it sounded when God talked to Abraham.
It was probably more intense than that. Yeah. Sacrifice your son. Sorry. So when he calls Abraham has to have a kind of certitude, like, I trust the living God to lead me to where I am supposed to go. But God actually says, to the place I will show you. Yeah. So he doesn't have this certitude when it comes to, like you're saying, I know what the future holds.
Interesting. And I mean, I think we could I'm promising myself and the listener to not get further afield. I wonder if there's a difference between even certainty and trust. And maybe what you're talking about with Abraham is trust. But even, like, again, I'm not tied up with the word, so it's fine that there's multiple meanings to it. But I love what you're saying here, that I think a lot of people, and I see this more in the Catholic Church, at least the sort of commentariat, the Catholic commentary, that they get disappointed because what they wanted was to know which mountain God was going to show up at. Mm-hmm. And they act like Catholicism promised them that when it didn't. And I think that's a great way to sort of like wrap up this first segment, Bud. I think a lot of the problems where people start to feel really jostled in their faith, part of it is just listening to people who are grifters and they make money stirring the pot. I think part of it is you listen to them because, like you said, you go in the past in the Bible, God promised he'd show the mountain, but not the mountain beforehand. And I think some people are acting like God was supposed to show their destination on the ticket when it was something God never promised. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, let's jump right back into it. We've been talking about a distinction between what we're calling truth and certainty. To be fair, you'll have to listen to the podcast and listen to the first segment if you haven't got a chance, because there's some parsing out to do. Making it as simple as possible and oversimplifying it. The truth is sort of an objective reality. It's the truth, whether you know it or absent to it or not. Certainty, did I say curiosity? I meant certainty. Certainty is something I have. It at least if it's not completely subjective, it comes from an individual. It's my state of certainty. I can believe in the truth and assent to the truth of something and not have certitude myself. Mm-hmm. What we're getting at and what we sort of left off at it is you made the great point about God. So Abraham trusted God, had faith in God, believed in the truth of what God was doing in his life. And God said, go and I will show you the mountain. Certitude wants to know the mountain before you take off with the ticket.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to sort of say it?
That's good.
And what I want to argue is that no one was ever promised that. And I know that maybe this is a different experience for cradle Catholics. I'm very willing to hear that out. As converts, I know. And I think that, but no matter what maybe was choppy about my RCIA experience or whatever, I had good friends that pointed out, God is not giving you a itinerary. Even when you get something like, not Fulton Sheen, what's his name? Who wrote Theology and Sanity?
Frank Sheed.
So he has a neat little catechism called A Map of Life. But it's interesting that it's a map and it's not directions. So Catholicism can say this is the map on which life, like the path of your life will take. And these are the places you want to go and all these things like this. What it can't tell you is you will end up here in X amount of days. And I think some people, at least in the Catholic commentary world, are confusing people because they are promising a certainty. They're saying, we should have been at this destination by now, or if no one tells you the destination, they're lying to you, which is a lot different than what the truth is. If our Lord on Gethsemane can pray, pass the chalice from me, but if not, your will be done. Certainly, bud, that doesn't mean that like we can go into this thing called Catholicism and act like we've been promised a certainty in life.
Yeah, I feel like some of what we're driving at is how we handle the truth properly. And so I'm not sure this is what you're saying. I'm actually sort of afraid now that I'm putting myself in the place of the sort of persons we were just criticizing. But I feel like sometimes there's a false search for a kind of certitude that's not given to us. Mm-hmm. Let me unpack that a little bit. So let's take something, and I'll kind of pick on my childhood past. So growing up in the Christian tradition that I did, we thought a lot about the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And every Christian worth their salt will say Revelation is true. But there are all sorts of different ways of interpreting the book of Revelation or the apocalypse. And some of those get really fancy. It's almost like Christian science fiction. What I mean by that is it really becomes an attempt to use the book to foresee the future. Mm-hmm. When I am in those conversations, you sometimes get the impression that the person who's peddling the very creative interpretation of Revelation thinks that you don't have a concern for the truth. You've departed from their interpretation. It's like, you don't think the book of Revelation is true? No, I think you may be using it in the wrong way. You got to be charitable how you come back. But even with this question of truth, I feel like there's really important genre questions. Yes. And by genre, I mean the truth that's given to us by God through the church and the scriptures, wherever. We have to pay attention to the genre, like what sort of teaching is it? And then how is it to be handled? And you say those things and you'll sometimes hear voices be like, oh, this guy's a squishy Catholic. He's a real lib. But again, I'm gonna fight tooth and nail to say at the end of the day, the book of Revelation was written by John. It was inspired by the Holy Spirit to help Christians to make sense of living in a world where Jesus had already achieved victory, but the world wasn't as God intended it to be. And so all of a sudden there is this symbolism where, the governing power, we have to respect the authorities instituted by God, but in some cases, those powers are bloodthirsty and they create martyrs and all these sorts of things. And so I want to say the very purpose of the book is not as like a spiritual decoder where we're trying to figure out the future. Right. In fact, our Lord warns against that sort of thing. But it's actually meant to cultivate a kind of trust that regardless of irrespective of where history takes us, that God is in charge, and we trust that all things are working together for good for those who God has called according to his purpose and plan.
I don't know why you were worried. That's exactly what I'm getting at. So Revelation is a great way to make my point. So, like you said, Revelation is a big book of grifters selling certainty, precisely because of its poetic nature, like you said. If you deal with any poetry and say like, oh, well, here's the paint by numbers decoding, and so now you don't have to worry because like, we're on step 10 of 20. That happens all the time. And if you haven't heard as a Catholic, believe me that you can hear it in the rest of Christianity. Certainly it's creeping in to Catholic world if it's not already firmly there, and I think it's firmly there. What I'll say is people, because they sign up for certainty instead of truth, or they get off the path of truth onto certainty because it's being sold. And I understand why people want certainty. Let me point out that I don't think it's like weak-minded people. It is very uncertain times. Certainty would be really lovely to have right now. But oftentimes I think the Bible itself says we are not promised it. One of the ways it's not promised, and I think this is important with Revelation, so people go, how can you say that the mountain or the end or the goal is not shown to us, but we're shown heaven, right? We talk about what the end of time is. But yeah, that's the end of time. Like eternity is outside of time, and the end of time is time being wrapped up. So we know the eternal destination, the real destination, the truest destination we all have. In time, because we live in time, we do not know the forks of the road we'll take, right? The Bible does not say through history there's like these 45 forks in the road, and the church always needs to take these. It says what eternity is. It says how time will wrap up into eternity. It talks about how eternity is already present in the here and now. It does not give like a TV guide schedule of what history is. And that's because it's not a book for curious people. This is what I'm getting at. It's a book for people who have wonder and awe and a love to learn, because to learn to love truth is to learn to love God. So that's all true. This is what comes into sort of educational, I'm bringing in John Henry Newman and things like this. Curiosity, bud, weirdly enough, when the word came into use in the English language, it was nearly synonymous with obscenity or pornography. The idea, right, was you were trying to learn things that you had no need to learn. Now, what I want to point out is I think people get it wrong if like there's bookshelves, and so like these are the books you can learn, and these are the ones you can't. I'll be very specific about this. We work at a medical college. If you're going into medicine, you're going to see a lot of naked bodies. You're going to see, right? You're going to get like into the details of the human body. Yeah. So that's not what makes something obscene, because you're not objectifying a body, right? You are trying to heal a body. And indeed, medicine that does objectify the body is quote unquote obscene and pornographic, even if people's clothes are on, because objectification is what's wrong. But like looking with respect and awe and for the sake of treating the body as an end in of itself because it's a creature of God. That is the distinction. What I'm arguing with is when we search for certainty, because we want the feeling of certainty rather than following and loving the truth, we don't love to learn. We don't love God. What we do is we're being obscene. We're being obscenely curious. We are looking into things not only that we shouldn't look into, but we can't. Yeah. Because to look for that is to objectify creation in a way that God does not want. Jesus himself said, of that time and hour, no one knows but the Father, like you said. Yeah. And even when it goes to the book of Revelation, the reason it's in poetry is to make it where you don't act like history is a checklist that just has to be checked off. And when the checklist is done, Revelation, the apocalypse happens. The problem with all of this, bud, is it's understandable to want certainty as a human. It's even understandable to try to get it as much as you can. Mm-hmm. But to seek certainty over truth is to make the truth an object. Do you see how this works, right? Instead of us being subservient to the truth and following it wherever it goes, we now objectify the truth and make it a tool in our kit to make us feel a certain way. I feel certain. I'm going to use the truth for my ends, for my use. I'm going to objectify the truth. Instead of let the truth be objective, I'm going to objectify it, make it subject to me and my feelings, and I'm going to use it to feel certain, which is silly because A, no human can ultimately feel certain. It's impossible for us. Our intellects aren't up to it, and we're all going to die, and we don't know when. A, so it's impossible. But B, but it is obscene. It is to objectify something that can't be subjected to us. That's the difference. Like, so curiosity is a word that we usually mean in good terms now. In the past and in the monastic context, they would worry about it. So curiosity is not like I went and read books I shouldn't. Curiosity is I used the truth as an object instrumentally for my own sake to feel certain. And that, to me, is why we're in the mess so much. And we see this all throughout the Catholic commentariat.
Well, I think we have to keep coming back to the question of faithfulness, or how are we supposed to live in the world in light of what's been communicated to us. And this goes back to the earlier point we were discussing about the distinction between prudential judgments and revealed truth. So you think about a statement like Jesus Christ is fully divine and fully human, and the kind of assent that we can give to that statement, and then prudential judgments, meaning someone may be drawing upon revelation, but then asking questions about how do you apply that in certain circumstances. And sometimes I see the two conflated, and that's where I think this really especially enters into the case when we're talking about the current political landscape. Mm-hmm. So when we get into like political debates about who should you vote for, which party should you support or something, I'm not saying we have to be agnostic about that, but sometimes someone will make a statement about the action that we should take, and they'll say like, oh, but politician X is really bad. Like, he's supporting some terrible things. And I'm like, I agree with your latter statement, but I disagree with your prudential judgment about how we should proceed. I need to tread lightly on this next statement because I'm drawing some on our graduate school experience, and I think the way that they handled this conversation was with too broad of strokes. But I think for Catholics living post-Christendom, so after you had a civilizational situation where the church was sort of in charge, I mean, it was much more complicated on the ground.
That was a messy reality.
Yeah, there were two swords, and bishops had a kind of political clout that they don't necessarily have today. In the wake of Christendom, our default mindset can sometimes be like, well, we should be in charge, or if we were just allowed to grab like the steering wheel of history, we could lead it down the right course. And all that I'm saying is, so I'm not someone who's hypercritical of Christendom, but not every era is characterized by that sort of political landscape. And so that raises all sorts of interesting questions about how should we live today. And the passage that's actually coming to mind for me as I talk about this is Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. And what's interesting about that is that does deal with the end of time. So we know that being called before the judgment seat of God, that will take place, quote unquote, in the future. We don't know, though, if it's going to be shortly after 2038 or 2475 or, 3000, whatever. But we know that at a future point, each one of us will have to give an account for how we treated the least of these. And that should orient our vision regardless of the polity that we're navigating. I mean,
no, that's great.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought it to this level because, what I'm saying different, and I might be plagiarizing someone, I always am, Bud, but what I know people have said in the past when they're talking about this in like the monastic setting, or I think Thomas Aquinas talks about this, they'll talk about vain curiosity, which is a subset of sloth or acedia. So that means you sort of like go look up things that aren't important to avoid the most important things you should look up. Mm-hmm. So that sort of curiosity is like, well, I'm going to go check Wikipedia forever, but what I really need to do is like explore my soul. And I'm not saying, I love Wikipedia, actually. Wikipedia rabbit holes to me are one of the most fantastic things about the modern world. We can get into that later. But I'm saying like, if you're like getting ready to, let's say you're a seminarian and tomorrow you're going to like take your vows, but you spent all night looking up Wikipedia rabbit trails rather than, like do the work you needed to do, that's vain curiosity. And it's acedia, it's sloth. It's doing small movements of the will when deep ones are required. What I'm arguing is there's obscene curiosity. And my guess is I'm just like putting in English something someone smarter than me said. And to me, it's this objectifying curiosity. And Bud, I think it's the politics stuff that you're dead on. Like a light turned on to me to realize, part of whether we as Christians are in control or not during an era, that's up to providence largely. Certainly human actors got involved, but let's even be honest about Christendom pops up precisely because Rome failed.
Yeah.
Not because Christianity really sort of had a game plan about, and this is how we'll conquer Rome. The first Christians who were in power, I mean, I'm probably overdoing it a bit, and I'm sure there's historians that would say I'm wrong. A lot of it was sort of like, oh, well, here we are. I mean, that's fair to say, right? Yeah. And so it's true that God handed over the keys to ruling societies multiple times in different places, and then subsequently in multiple places took those keys away.
Yeah.
So when we get vainly curious about the seasons, right? And I mean this in sort of like the epochal seasons, when we try to sort of read the tea leaves about whether we should be in control of society or not, I think we both get vainly and obscenely curious because we take the Christian truth and we start acting like it's a political mechanism to get us back in power, rather than, as you so eloquently said, Matthew 25 as an eternal mandate, always applicable.
Yeah.
Whether you are a pauper or a king, insofar as you have any influence at all, you will be held account to Matthew 25. And to worry too much about like how we take the reins of power back or whether we should, man, I'm with you. I think that is a vain and obscene curiosity rather than a wonder, an awe, a love of learning, a contemplation. That I did not plan to talk about before the show, but I think that that's right.
I like how you appeal to history, and that's a really interesting thought experiment where I think about these certain points in history, like right before the Reformation, or if you've read St. Augustine on the collapse of the empire, maybe you could think about during the midst of World War II, like right before the collapse of the Roman Empire, there was something sort of horrifying in that, to see the order around you completely collapsing in on itself, and then for God to raise up someone like Saint Benedict and what he achieved. Or like, it's hard for us to really go back to World War II and to be in the midst of World War II, and you had to feel like Europe might not make it.
Yeah.
What's funny, so there was something apocalyptic, I think, about what came next, but it was completely different than sort of what people were anticipating. So ironically enough, post World War II Europe, people were, they had to psychologically make sense of the terrible nature of what had just occurred. But really, I feel like the struggle for the church post World War II is one of affluence and people drifting away from the faith because things are just too comfortable. You know, with the Reformation, I mean, someone like Luther, he had to feel like an antichrist figure to a lot of Catholic church leaders. But God immediately, we didn't move to the end of time. We moved to the greatest missionary expansion in Catholic history. So you don't know what's going to come next. And if you're too fixated with like the paint by numbers, connect the dots plan, you might miss out on what God is actually doing.
And I mean, this is like a huge thing. I'm going to pull a you and throw out something incredibly crazy in the last minute. That world of affluence and the worldliness of the church, the obscene curiosity, I think leads to, I don't know a better way to put it, Bud, but like the sort of sexualization of theology that we've seen in so many of the abuse cases that have come up. That is vain, obscene curiosity that objectifies both theology and the person and the truth of both and uses that to wield power over other people. I don't think it's just a matter of me tisk-tisking the Catholic commentariat that needs to follow truth more than it needs to go after certainty. But I think some of the deepest difficulties and wrongs, and just as Benedict XVI called it, filth that we have to atone for and clean up, is rooted in this instrumentalization of theology, of people, and of turning something beautiful like the truth and the love of truth and the desire for God into instrumentalizing, objectifying curiosity. That's quite a terrible thing to end on for the segment, but I think it's something that we should pray about, that we might look to find truth rather than narcoticize ourselves with the comfort of certainty. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, be that as it may, if it were. The real thing is to say whether you're listening on Iowa Catholic Radio's radio network and all of the wonderful places we have stations transmitting this message throughout Iowa, or iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our beautiful, wonderful, sagistic listeners on podcast. We love all of you. We appreciate your ability to make this happen. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, you said when we went off air, like, way to land the helicopter, and I said maybe land it by throwing out a bomb. I hope that what we talked about, I don't want it to rattle cages, but I do hope that in Lent, it's a good way for us to think about, because, that is what Lent is up to. We're trying to not grasp onto things of the faith for our own sake, but in letting stuff go, allowing stuff, so to speak, to cradle us, to hold us. And sometimes that means it's easy to think about it when we're like, well, don't, stop doing something that you're addicted to, or a pleasure that you like. It's another thing to say, in my relationship to the church, to other people who matter most to me, is there attachment I have that on the surface looks like it might be good, right? Wanting certitude, but is there a way that I can reorient myself in that as well to have a true Lent that brings me back around to loving and worshiping Christ in a way that wasn't the case before Lent started?
Yeah, we didn't plan it that way, but it did end up being a very Lenten episode, and that's okay. There's, like the book of Ecclesiastes says, there's a time to laugh and a time to weep. There's a time for everything. So I think this is an appropriate season. Lent's also an appropriate season for you to deepen your prayer life with us here at Iowa Catholic Radio. You can join us and pray in the Rosary at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
If you go to iowacatholicradio.com, you can check out the events page and see everything that we have lined up for people in the listening areas that are on Iowa Catholic Radio. So on March 8th, for instance, out at West Des Moines, St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church, Man Up West Power Lunch, Ryland Jones, who currently works with the Ut Fidem program at Dowling Catholic High School, he's going to be out there. On March 9th in Cedar Rapids, St. Pius X Catholic Church, and for the Archdiocese of Dubuque Men's Conference, 2024 Men's Conference. Make sure to go check out where you can register and see who all is speaking there. April 12th at Altoona, St. John and Paul, we have Peter Herbeck at St. John and Paul, that starts at 6 p.m. out there. Altoona on April 12th. On May 9th at Norwalk, we're going to have the Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic. And then if you look all the way into June 22nd, Bud, I know hard to think of in February, but out in West Des Moines, we'll have the Iowa Catholic Radio Family Night, and the details will be coming up shortly. Also, I just want to remind you, we were speaking about Lent. Bud made a good point to show how you could pray with us during Lent. Fasting, maybe you don't eat a cheeseburger and then listen to us. That might be fasting enough. But of course, with almsgiving, please always remember us that this ministry is not just the people on the air or behind the boards or behind the desks. This is your ministry, this ministry that penetrates through walls, that reaches out to people and is always there waiting for them to click on the channel in a time of need. This ministry is yours, and it's not possible, of course, without your prayers and your volunteer hours, but certainly without your monetary contributions. You can donate to Iowa Catholic Radio on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or call or text 515-223-1150. Thank you for supporting Iowa Catholic Radio through the years. We are so appreciative of the people who do that for us. God bless you, and please remember us in your almsgiving during Lent. Bud, fantastic episode. Wonderful to be able to contemplate the truth, even if, I don't know, what's your certitude level now? 1 through 5.
I was going to say 6.3, but I'll go with a 4.
Well, I'm certain of one thing. It's always great to record a show with you, buddy.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks for the idea today. This one we can chalk up to Bo. So if you disliked the episode, you can blame it on him.
That is certainly the truth. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, solar system, galaxy, nation, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.